Imagine that you're an empire trying to hide the fact that it's an empire. You are propping up countries that are favorable to you, and you are destroying or undermining the countries that are unfavorable to you. But in both cases, you have to convince the population back home that what you're doing in both sets of countries is supported in both of those sets of countries. There's one great way to do that, and it is through elections. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism's read-through of this incredible book, Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. We are talking today about Chapter 3, which is Legitimizing versus Meaningless Third World Elections. The main thrust of this chapter is that the United States will wage a propaganda war to convince everyone that elections with favorable outcomes are legitimate and the elections with unfavorable outcomes are meaningless. And the US has been doing this for a long time. Back in 1966, the authors talk about this, in the Dominican Republic, they organized what the authors call a demonstration election, which is fantastic terminology. And since that time, they've kind of just kept going. So we're going to look at 3 elections and then one extra election at the end that's a little more contemporary that I want to kind of update our understanding here. Because one of the things that I keep saying about this book is that even though it was written in 1988, it is never more relevant than today. Like a lot of things that you will see in this book will keep popping up through time. And so I think it's important that we deal with that 4th election, even though it's not mentioned in the book. So we'll talk about El Salvador's 1982 and the 1984 election, and then the elections in 1984 for both Guatemala and Nicaragua. So those are from the book, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. And then at the end, right at the end, I want to talk about Haiti. I want to skip forward in future to 2010 and talk about US intervention in Haiti, how it played out in the media, and just give a little bit of an updated perspective to try to make the point that this stuff is still going on today and that we won't necessarily know about it. We will talk about this when we get to it, but one of the reasons that we know about the 2010 intervention from the US in Haiti is that Hillary Clinton's emails were leaked and posted on WikiLeaks, and so a bunch of people started to look at these and say, wait, hang on, this is a lot more interventionist than we previously knew about. So there's a lot of this stuff going on all the time, and the US is constantly playing this game. And to really understand the game that the US plays, we got to dig into this chapter. One thing that I want to mention before we get into this properly is that at the time that this book is being written, a lot of leftists really lionized the Sandinistas in Nicaragua for a very good reason. And if you want more of that history, you can go back to the first lecture, the introduction lecture that I did on this book, and get a little bit of the history of the Somoza family and what exactly the Sandinistas had to go through. And that lecture starts all the way back with Nicolás Sandino, the revolutionary peasant, and the uprising that he caused. But just to set this out, the Sandinistas were considered heroes of the left at the time, but they refer at several points to a politician that took power in that 1984 election that we're going to look at in Nicaragua. That's Daniel Ortega. If that name rings a bell, it's because Ortega is still president after he sort of systematically rid the system of his opponents over time, and he returned to power officially in 2007. And he's been there ever since. And this is kind of a common theme, by the way. A leftist revolution overthrows an evil former power and then becomes itself the evil power. We've seen this time and time again. It's something that actually Frantz Fanon, who was the first book that we covered on this channel, it's something that Frantz Fanon warns us about and really worries about. It happened in Russia, it happened in Venezuela, and it happened in Nicaragua. That doesn't change the Herman and Chomsky analysis. Everything that they say in this book still holds true. It's just that over time, the left really fell out of favor with the Sandinistas, especially the leftist commentariat, which Herman and Chomsky definitely belong to. So I just wanted to mention that at the start. We will be talking about this, but I do not consider Daniel Ortega, who won that 1984 election, to be quite as wonderful and exemplary a figure of a politician as they sort of allude to him being in this book. Now let's go ahead and dig in. We need to start with a little bit of the theoretical background, a little bit of the model that they build out. So this is what Herman and Chomsky call the election propaganda frameworks. They are general ways that the government will talk about elections. And there are a few things we need to hit here. The first one is the manipulation of symbols and agenda. And that for Herman and Chomsky means associating words like democracy with the military regime that the United States backs. We see this a lot. And the sort of narrative that they try to construct is this military power, and we really see this now as well, this military power that we are allied with in this region, they may not be perfect. We're the first to admit that they do a lot of things wrong. And sure, of course, they're reluctant. But look, they are agreeing to hold a democratic election anyway. This is very much the case in El Salvador, which is a military government that the U.S. is propping up. And the U.S. is propping up military governments throughout Latin America at this time. This is a time of Operation Condor. This is a really, really brutal period with death squads roaming the countryside and killing dissidents and killing leftists, torturing people, everything. But what the U.S. government here can say as they sort of stand back and, by the way, say nothing about their involvement in the training of the death squads, which happened a lot, but they will sit back and they will say, listen, we know it's not perfect, but they are making this step to hold a democratic election. We will support them because they are the party that is safeguarding this transition to democracy. And if there is one thing that the United States loves around the world, but maybe not so much at home, it is democracy. They are always fostering democracy. They're always happy to go out and make sure that democracy is being fostered around the world in these countries. So this is just something to keep in the back of your mind when you see this kind of manipulation of the words democratic, especially when it comes to a military regime. The opposite side to that as well is that several rebel groups may very reasonably refuse to participate in that election, and that allows the American government to brand them as anti-democratic, right? They just want power. They don't want to participate in this democratic process, so they must be trying to undermine democracy. Very clever. Second thing to mention is that official observers typically are just there to provide cover. Chomsky and Herman in this book provide a really interesting analysis of some of the kind of the ways that the official voting election observers will operate. Now, one thing I will say is that this has actually gotten way better. A lot of the time, the election observers are there to provide cover, but there are election observer agencies that do genuinely good and important work, and we shouldn't necessarily immediately write them off, but we do need to consider this as a potential tool of the powerful. Just extreme skepticism at all points about official election observers and their conclusions. Then, thirdly, when it comes to things that would actually help, these are typically off the table. So things like free speech, the freedom of the press, freedom of organizing, the freedom to form political parties, the absence of coercion, etc. And we will see a lot more of this in Haiti's case. These things that actually would help in these scenarios. Typically, among the U.S. hand-waving about military dictatorships holding elections, they will say, well, in this case, this political party cannot be allowed to form, and that's fine. And then along with all of this, there's this brilliant quote on page 90 where they quote the Secretary of State at the time, Schultz. They say, quote, as noted by Secretary of State Schultz, the important thing is that if there is to be an electoral process, it be observed not only at the moment when people vote, but in all the preliminary aspects that make the election meaningful. And that's the end of Schultz's quote. And Herman and Chomsky go on to say, spelling this out further, Schultz mentioned explicitly that for elections to be meaningful, rival political groups must be allowed to form themselves and have access to people, to have the right of assembly, to have access to the media. Those remarks were made apropos of the 1984 Nicaraguan election. No congresspersons or media commentators raised any question about whether these criteria should perhaps be applied to the Salvadoran or Guatemalan elections scheduled during the same year. Which is just to say, when it is an unfavorable government in power, the media and people in power will make a lot of noise about this not being totally above board and why wasn't this political party allowed to form. But when it's in a favorable government and those same political parties are not allowed to form, especially political parties from the left, they will just kind of quietly shut up about it. And the irony of all of this, of course, is that the conditions that we're talking about are significantly better for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to field a political party and run a campaign. They were significantly better in Nicaragua than they were in El Salvador or Guatemala. And Herman and Chomsky run through the full comparison. We're not going to do too much of a deep dive into this, but I do just want to hit the key points here. Specifically, they are looking at freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of organization, freedom to campaign, and the absence of state terror and a climate of fear. With speech first. Let's talk about this first. Free speech was constrained in Nicaragua, but dissidents mostly spoke out without fear of reprisals, and there was a massive difference in scale. So Herman and Chomsky are quick to note this, right? Like, Nicaragua is not perfect. This is not some kind of utopia that they're talking about. Of course, free speech is constrained. This is a very, very tough time for the Sandinista government, and like a lot of governments at the time, and this is not to excuse anything, but like a lot of governments at the time, they clamped down on what could be said and what didn't. But these are massively different effects from the ones that you find in Guatemala and El Salvador. El Salvador had almost entirely removed access to free speech in 1980. Officially. This is done through Decree number 507, which permitted citizens to be held by the armed forces without charge or any evidence whatsoever for 180 days. And meanwhile, in Guatemala was actively murdering and torturing dissidents. This is a completely different atmosphere than the one in Nicaragua. The authors note that public demonstrations were allowed during the 1984 elections, but they were allowed with 3 days advance notice and with approval from the military authorities. So really, how free are these demonstrations actually? When it comes to freedom of the press, in El Salvador, all the major papers that were critical of the government were closed by 1981. In Guatemala, journalists were actively being murdered, and in Nicaragua, there was censorship, but opposition papers continued to operate freely. So again, this is a little bit of the difference that you start to see here. All the criticisms that the US levies against Nicaragua and is very quiet about in El Salvador and Guatemala, the actual facts, if you dig in, are completely reversed. When it comes to organization of political parties, again, El Salvador and Guatemala both clamped down very hard on opposition of any kind. El Salvador actually officially outlawed parties on the left. And we should say in both El Salvador and Guatemala, there were different parties that were allowed to run and different candidates, but they were all typically from the same rough side of the political spectrum. In El Salvador, for example, Dabuison and Duarte ran against each other. These are people that we met in the first introduction lecture to this chapter. And in Guatemala, it's often held up that Vinicio Cerezo actually won in the case of Guatemala. And he was not part of the ruling military dictatorship at the time. But these weren't actual choices, is what Herman and Chomsky are saying here. These are very similar, very US-friendly candidates in every case. And so you're voting, but the differences between the candidates that are being offered to you, not actually all that much different. In Nicaragua, meanwhile, there was a huge spectrum of candidates and different choices. The Sandinistas were an incredibly popular party, and they could afford to do this. And they could afford to do this much better than the other two countries. So in Nicaragua's case, the Sandinistas didn't really have to clamp down too much on outside parties or dissent, but it is nonetheless the case that there were a broad spectrum of candidates that were being fielded in the Nicaraguan election, whereas they were tightly constrained in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala. And then, lastly, we should mention the climate of terror. If you're heading to a voting booth, it doesn't really matter how many parties are running or how free speech is. If there's a chance that you vote the wrong way or say the wrong thing, and you get picked up by a death squad, well, that's a difference in scale, let's say. And as far as it goes for the climate of terror in each country, in both El Salvador and Guatemala, they were murdering civilians, and that was not really the case in Nicaragua at all. So we're left with this. All of the framing that was done by the State Department and by the media and the journalists that picked that up was just kind of spin. And Herman and Chomsky do a really incredible job of analyzing the reporting and the situation and the facts on the ground to make this case. And it's kind of brilliant, and it's one of the reasons that I hold this book up as just a tremendous example of media criticism, and one that looms over contemporary media criticism in such a real way. Just like any good media critics worth their salt, Herman and Chomsky then go into the actual media analysis. So, in El Salvador, the American media trumpeted the turnout in a mandatory turnout election, by the way. That was not mentioned, but they didn't at any point mention the shuttering of newspapers or any of the criticisms that we just talked about. In Guatemala, the coverage was a little bit more balanced, but when Cerezo won, it was presented as the breaking of military power. It just wasn't. What's interesting about the Cerezo win, and this comes straight from the book as well, is that the New York Times actually framed this against the Sandinistas. They said it could be a model for other countries, holding up Benicio Cerezo as this candidate who could break the power of a military. And this is where we get the Ortega mention, because they pull from a Stephen Kinzer article on page 115. And by the way, if you read any Latin American history, Stephen Kinzer still kind of looms quite large over the history of Latin America. He's written a lot about this, and a lot of really good work as well, I should say, but clearly colored by this perspective. So this is from the Kinzer article, or this is from the analysis of the Kinzer article, I should say. On page 115, Herman and Chomsky writes, quote, "The article closes with a quote from an opposition figure. Ortega is now the last president in Central America who wears a military uniform, and the contrast is going to be evident." This again, talking about Daniel Ortega, by the way. Nowhere in the article does Kinzer point out that the army power cannot be read from whether the head of state wears a uniform, or that the rule of the army in Guatemala has not yet been overcome. He does not refer to the fact that the Guatemalan army has killed tens of thousands of ordinary civilians, nor does he show any recognition of the fact that the election held in Nicaragua was much more open than that held in Guatemala. On the contrary, this is a fact that the media, including the New York Times, explicitly and consistently deny in accordance with state imperatives. End quote. So that's how the media is taking and spinning the elections in El Salvador and Guatemala. Let's take a look at Nicaragua now. So there was an enormous campaign in the US press to discredit the Nicaraguan election. And the authors say that in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala, the press were really worried that outside, read leftist, rebels would disrupt the election. In Nicaragua, the rebels, read right-wing parties, were the heroes. And by the way, this might sound kind of familiar, right? I have no love for Nicolás Maduro, the administration in Venezuela, obviously, but every time an opposition candidate randomly pops up, be it Juan Guaidó or Edmundo González, they are absolutely deified in the American press. Every single time. We should note in the case of Nicaragua that the US-financed and US-trained Contras were even brought into the political process in Nicaragua. When we talk about a spectrum of candidates in Nicaragua, and obviously this is because the Sandinistas could afford to bring them in, but they were nonetheless brought in, even the Contras that ended up destabilizing the government were brought into that initial political process, that 1984 election. And just to go back to that point about rebels, again, every time a rebel pops up that has a questionable popular mandate, if they are against the regime that is considered anti-American, they will almost every time be held up and lionized in this way. Now, we've gone through the main points of this chapter. I do want to hit on the question of Haiti, though, before we wrap up here. And if you want the full story on this, by the way, there's a really interesting Jake Johnston piece that pulls all of this together in CEPR. That's the Center for Economic and Policy Research. They do some really interesting stuff. And Johnston specifically goes through the Clinton emails to try to piece together a little bit about what was happening and pulls from staffers and tries to deconstruct or reconstruct, rather, a little bit of this story and a little bit of what happened in Haiti to try to understand how the U.S. actually influence this election, because it's a very, very strange process. And we'll get to this in a sec, but in the press, a lot of what was happening was just reporting on general chaos, right? There are general protests out there. There are accusations of electoral fraud. There's an OAS investigation. There's all of this stuff going on in the press. It's presented by so much, and there's not much parsing of what is actually going on. So it almost takes necessarily a post-mortem process, something like Johnston and CEPR, to really go in and kind of dig out what the heck happened in this whole thing. The story here is that in 2010, there were three main political candidates for the presidency in Haiti. You had Jules Celestin, the candidate of the outgoing president, René Préval, who had cozied up to Venezuela. He was prime minister when Jean-Bertrand Aristide was in power, and Aristide was a U.S. enemy, and actually a very, very interesting figure that continues a little bit to loom over Haitian politics in contemporary times. So Celestin, as far as the U.S. is concerned, not a good pick for the presidency. And also the only one of the three candidates, and listen, I am no fan of Préval or Celestin by any real means, but Celestin at this point is pretty much the only candidate who's slightly to the left and might risk being a little bit anti-US at this point. But then you had the other two candidates. You had Myrla Manija, and I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, by the way, but she was a center-right candidate. The third candidate that you have in here is Michel Martelly, who eventually becomes president. He's better known, by the way, as Sweet Mickey. He was a singer before he was a politician, and he spent some time in power, but recently, actually, as in the last few years, I believe, he was sanctioned by the US on drug trafficking charges. And before that, he was sanctioned by Canada. So this is sort of a long-going thing here. Anyway, Martelly is the third candidate in this election, and he comes third in the first round of votes. So it's Celestin versus Manija. And again, this is a risk that Celestin may win. And this first round election is marred by a lot of violence afterwards. And tons of accusations of fraud. Just people feel like this process was very weird. And so the Organization of American States is called in at the behest of the United States to do a little bit of an investigation. And they conclude, mysteriously, that Celestin had actually come in third. This is based on nothing, by the way, and we've done post-mortem analysis on this as well. But it was essentially just a model that could not have yielded this result, but they really ran with it. So essentially what you have here is the U.S. looking at this election and seeing a chance, especially then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. This is Obama administration, remember? So Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her staff see an opportunity to force out a candidate that they don't like and maybe put in a candidate that would be more willing to deal with the United States. And Haiti, since the 50s, has been in the U.S.'s sphere of influence. And I could truly fill hours and hours of video about the evil, heinous stuff that the U.S. has done in Haiti, by the way, but that history is something that we will have to come to eventually because it is truly wild. But the U.S. has never been afraid to go into Haiti and do some deeply evil shit. Anyway, after this OAS analysis and the conclusion that Celestin actually came in third, rather than run a totally new election, they just sub Celestin for Martelly. So this is intense pressure. And what we learned later is that emails to Hillary Clinton, again revealed by WikiLeaks, showed that there was a coordinated campaign to swap Martelly for Celestin. And that leaves these two center-right and more likely to be US client candidates in the race. This is all really interesting. And it begs the question, what was the reaction then in the press? Well, the reaction, as we have learned to expect from manufacturing consent, was pretty standard. They accepted the OAS analysis without question, and they reported the departure of Celestin as a move made due to international pressure and because of these more generally fraudulent results. Again, we don't know at this point why they're fraudulent, how they're fraudulent. There's no call for a new election beyond the second round. But it was just generally accepted that Celestin, even though he had come in second, by the way, in the first round, he had come in second. But even then, there was just this general idea that, well, there must have been fraud and he must have come in third, so let's force him out of the race. And that was kind of the consensus. If you look through reporting at the time in the New York Times and in the opinion pages as well, there's just this feeling that something weird has happened and they don't really question Celestin dropping out. And then even when emails point to intervention by the US, there's not much reporting about that in the mainstream press at all, right? You have CEPR, which is an academic institution, and you have a little bit of reporting around the margins and sort of the leftist presses. A Dissent magazine does a little bit about it. But really, it's kind of picked up and dropped. And of course, this is all coming out in the context of the election, Hillary versus Trump. So the media is swallowed by another whale. That is sort of what happens all the time. But at this point, there's not really anything else that comes out about that. This is something that is academically reported, but the fact that the US is intervening in yet another election, yet again, just gets immediately swept under the rug. And it gets swept under the rug because it doesn't fit the model, the propaganda model, or the needs and desires of the ruling elite in the United States at the time. And that is just more of the same, just what we should expect from all of this. So all of this is to say that nothing has really changed at all. This is still very much going on all the time in all the ways that we won't necessarily know about until later on or possibly never, because the flow of information is so tightly controlled and it's tough to see what the truth of these situations actually is until you get a really in-depth analysis like CEPR, or especially like manufacturing consent, that can really go in and dig deep and understand these issues. So this has just been a general discussion and a little bit of an update on the third chapter in manufacturing consent. I hope you're reading this chapter along with this video because there's a lot more detail that we could get into. This is a lot more history and a lot more discussion of the things like the observers, the international observers that are being sent and are either being picked up by the mainstream press or, in the case of Nicaragua, completely ignored, even though in Nicaragua's case, they may have been significantly more reputable. This is the argument that Herman and Chomsky are making. We're not going to go super into all of that detail because it would take truly 6 days to get through all of this historical background, but it is nonetheless fascinating, as I hope you're reading this sort of in conjunction with these videos. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I really appreciate it. As always, let me know what you think, either here or on Patreon. You can follow this feed on patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Any of my socials, you can get in touch and just let me know how you are feeling about this, what you think about this. What do you think? Is there anything, if anything, that we can do to help this situation along? Anything like that, I'm always curious to hear. So follow along on the Patreon, follow me on socials, and we will be back next week to discuss the KGB plot to murder the Pope. That wasn't real and never was real, and the press just sort of ran with it, and the US government was like, yeah, totally, that makes a lot of sense, let's do it. So this has been really fascinating to get through. Thank you as always, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.